Hi everyone, this is Pastor Jason Abbott with Glade Baptist Church. If you're a member of Glade Baptist or a visitor, then we're glad that you're keeping up with us online. And if you're somebody who's just kind of connected with us through these online videos, then welcome. We're glad that you're being a part as well. You can continue to like and share our content. We appreciate that. And if you want to send some Facebook messages and those kind of things, ask questions, that's great too. We welcome that. Today we're doing something a little bit different. This is kind of an additional video from the usual Sunday sermon video. This is going to be more of like a Bible study kind of thing. What we want to do is give you some information just to kind of go along with what we're going to be talking about in our sermon. Hopefully give you some histories, just kind of paint the picture for you, just kind of add the details, kind of give you a deeper look into the text and what's going on, and just kind of, fill in any blanks that you might have. Just kind of give that to you. And so that's the purpose of this video today. It's a little bit different. Our focus on this Sunday will be Acts chapter 17. And so that's where our text is going to be primarily about, Acts chapter 17. Let me say a few things, starting off with Acts chapter 17. It comes to us in the point where Paul has been on his missionary journeys, and he has Silas, trusted friend, and Timothy with him, and because of some circumstances that happen, they become separated, and Paul has to leave them, and he ends up traveling to Athens, and this is where our story picks up. So he's in Athens, Greece. This is all happening about 51 AD, if you want to kind of put it into a time frame, about 51 AD. And so he goes to Athens, and Athens is kind of like the cultural center of the Roman Empire. Now, that's not to say it's not the only one. It had, the educational centers. It was the cultural center. It had a lot of influence on Roman culture as well within the empire. Athens was pretty much the high point for that. But, like I said, they're not the only one. There are other two that were highly regarded and notable in their own right were Alexandria in Egypt and Tarsus, which is where Paul is from. And so when Paul steps into this world of Athens, of intellectualism and education and all this kind of stuff, Paul's no slacky. Paul is a highly educated man, and he comes from a part of the world that values education and learning, and he is probably well suited for the task that God has called him to do. And so this is where we find him, like I said, about 51 AD. He walks into Athens. Athens, like I said, is a very prominent city, probably a population around 40,000 people at this time. So he's in Athens, and he begins to follow his normal routine. He engages with those in the synagogues, the Jewish gathering places of worship. And he also begins to engage people in ministry and preaching and discussing things in the marketplace, the agora of Athens. And so he's doing this, and he's making his usual routine with engaging and talking and preaching and all this kind of thing. And he notices, the text really does emphasize how badly this troubles him. It's really something that burdens him. It just kind of, makes him ache to see all the idolatry in Athens. There's shrines, there's temples, there's statues, all this worship of these false gods and goddesses. And so he's going through the city and he's picking up on all this, and it just seems like everywhere he turns, there's some of this stuff. He can't get away from it, and it just kind of burdens him to see people so far from God and with so many distractions to seeing the true God, and maybe a distraction from hearing his message that he is bringing to them, because he is someone who has met the true God. He is someone who has an encounter with Jesus after the resurrection. And so he's troubled by all this, and so, but he still perseveres. He still wants to engage this community, this city, these people with the truth of the gospel, and to bring to them the message of Jesus Christ. And so Paul goes about this despite his troublesome spirit with all the idolatry. That obstacle is just something he's going to have to push through and continue to be focused on his calling. Well, he comes across something called the altar to the unknown God. And if you look in your text in Acts chapter 17, this comes out in verse 23 specifically. So he's coming across this altar to an unknown God. So after all these altars and all these shrines and all these statues and all these temples and all of this, and especially it's all going on in the shadow of the city and the marketplace and everything, it's all happening in the shadow of this giant temple, the Parthenon on the Acropolis hill, and the temple to Athena Nike, and all the shrines and everything that's going on up there. It's all in the shadow, of that. It kind of overlooks the city. And so he comes across this altar to an unknown God. Now it's a very interesting thing that he comes across, because they've got all these gods and goddesses that they're worshiping and paying homage to and being devoted to and making sacrifices to and different stuff. But there's an altar to an unknown God as well, and probably not just one. There might have been as many as a dozen. They came about because generations before, and this comes to us through Epimenides, generations before, there was a pestilence that had ravaged the city and the area. And so they were desperate and they were scared and they were clueless about what to do about it, because it was unrelenting. And so he came up with the idea, and they followed suit with it. He came up with the idea that it had to be because the gods were angry. It had to be that the gods were angry, they're upset, we're not doing right, they're feeling neglected, something like that. And so he comes up with this idea to bring these sheep into Athens. And in doing so, they let them into the city and into that area surrounding. And whenever one would lay down, they would look to see where the nearest statue or shrine to a god or goddess was, and they would take it and they would sacrifice it in honor of that god or goddess. And so all these sheep that are wandering around, they're paying attention to them, they're following them, and they're saying, this is how we're going to make sure that all these gods are getting the proper homage, the proper devotion, the proper sacrifice. And so these sheep are being sacrificed throughout the city in to be devoted to whatever statue or shrine or altar that is nearby to that god or goddess. Well, the question came up, what if a sheep lays down and there's not one nearby? Well, this was their answer to that. They were going to build a shrine, sacrifice the animal, and then build a shrine there to wherever that animal was, and say, look, we don't know who to devote this to, but to this unknown God that we can't identify, we can't put a name to this unknown God, we are going to sacrifice this animal for you in homage to you. And so that's where that comes about. And so Paul walks into Athens and he's doing his thing, and he comes across this, and so he makes use of it. And so when he speaks to the people of Athens, when he's in the courts, that's what he brings up. He points them to the altar of the unknown God and says, this is what I'm proclaiming to you. You've got all these gods and goddesses and everything else, and you're a very religious people, and you're really devoted to religious rituals and stuff. But what I come to proclaim to you today is a God that you don't know, but you should honor, because he is the God of all. He's the creator of heaven and earth. All this stuff, other stuff, is distractions. It's nothing. So then we see in our text, and we can pick up in our verses chapter 17, verses 18 and 19. We see him engaging with two different groups of people that were a part of a philosophical group. They had this certain philosophy. It's how they, guided their lives. It's what they based their beliefs on. It's the things that they, held true. Because the idolatry and the people that honored the gods and the goddesses and that mythology and these legendary figures and all of that, well, not everybody really thought that that was actually true because there was no evidence for them. And so, these stories have been passed down for ages and ages and ages, and a lot of people, the common people, the people that, probably didn't have a lot of education or knowledge of places outside of Athens, they bought into it. And so they just followed that kind of tradition. And so you had philosophical groups that challenged that and just, didn't buy into it at all. Well, the Epicureans was one group that confronts Paul. Well, these Epicureans, just to give you a little bit about them, they came about because of the teaching of a philosopher named Epicurus. And this is around 300 BC, roughly. And so this group grows out of his teachings, and they follow him, and they think, the kind of teachings that he's had and what he's had to say, is really how a person should order their life. It's really how things are. It's, really how people should, design their belief system. They believed Epicurus had that. Well, these Epicureans, their idea was that if there is a god or gods, like we're worshipped in Athens, they're probably a long way away, and they don't have anything to do with us. They're distant. They may exist, they may not, but there's not so much we can really know, and they're so distant and they're so detached, and they're fine where they're at. They don't care really about us. They're just doing their thing, and we're here on earth. They also had the idea that you really wanted to be in harmony and in peace with the world, and the way to do that was to get away from things that would be harmful to you. And so they emphasized pleasure. They said, the highest good, is for you to seek pleasure. And they didn't necessarily mean fleshly pleasure, anything like that. It was kind of like a devotion and a love for the pleasures of the mind. The things that, aren't so tangible necessarily, like, something fleshly. They would have put a very big emphasis on engaging with reason and, having these kind of thought debates. That's kind of how they lived their life and what they taught. As you can see, that idea and those kind of things are still very prevalent today, maybe even almost dominant in a Western civilization. The belief that, well, there might be a God and there might not, and if there is, well, he's very distant and he doesn't care about us, and we're on our own, and we just got to figure out how to live our life the best we can, and hey, the best thing you can do is just be happy, whatever makes you happy. If your marriage doesn't make you happy, in that. If your work doesn't make you happy, well, then leave the job. And if this doesn't make you happy, then change that too. And so you can see that that kind of thinking is still very prevalent today. It still has effect on us, and it finds its source in Epicurus. And it heavily influenced the thought behind deism, which you may recall even a few of the founders of our country dabbled in. And so Epicureanism was very influential and very big at this time. And so Paul is engaging with them, this group, and their beliefs and challenging them and confronting them. And he has their attention, and they're involved in an encounter that he has that ends up in court. Another group that engages with him and ends up bringing him to court are the Stoics. And this is another philosophical group. They find their origin in a man named Zeno, and he's not an Athenian. He's actually from Cyprus, the island of Cyprus. And this also happens around the same time period, around 300 BC, is what we're talking about, where it originates. And, well, it's not called Zenoism, even though he's the founder. It gets its name actually from stoa, which is the Greek word for porch, because it's kind of pointing back to where he would teach his disciples and his students. And so that's where the name would come from. But anyways, Zeno and others along the way, other significant leaders in that belief system of Stoicism, what they were teaching was a very pantheistic view. And so it's almost kind of like the complete opposite in some ways of Epicurean views. Their idea is that there is a divine being within all the world. And so it's not that the gods are distant and they don't care about us and we don't even know if they're really there. It's that everything is divine. And that nature should be highly regarded because it too contains elements of the divine. And so they had an idea about a passive divine nature and an active divine nature, and the things that were going on in the world, and that was their belief system. Now, they also believed that because that's just the way things are, it's just that nature and all these things just happen. It was cyclical, and so the world and its events and all that's going on, it happened and it'll happen again, and it'll happen again. And those in what would be called the high Stoics, they believed that eventually that cycle would come to an end, and probably fire, the whole thing would be burned up, and then all the things would cycle and start over again. And they would happen exactly like they did before. And so you're in this endless cycle of, yeah, it's happened, it's going to happen again, it's happened again, yeah, it's happened before, so what, it's going to happen again. A little bit of fatalism you can see in that, along with that very prominent pantheistic view that everything has divinity in it. You can see that has not really gone away at all either. There's still that kind of thought process you'll find in a lot of people in Western civilization. So, not so different. Now, the Stoics, like I said, were quite fatalistic, because if everything's going to happen again and again and again, exactly the same way it did, well, there's not so much to do about it. In fact, some of the Stoics were quite adamant that if you don't like the way things are, you're free to leave, which basically meant suicide. That's how fatalistic it was. So that's the world, and that's the thought process that Paul is engaging with. That pantheistic, fatalistic kind of view, that kind of acceptance of things, and that eternal cycle upon cycle upon cycle. That's what Paul is confronting and challenging with the gospel. Now, there's another group, and once Paul is in court, he kind of takes a jab, if you want to call it that. He kind of takes a bit of a commentary against them as well, to just kind of show them that he's aware of their presence. These are the ones we'd call the academics, and these were highly educated people, and probably best known through Cicero and his writings. But these academics had the idea that, these gods and whatnot, that, all these shrines are made to, and all these temples and everything, and these statues, well, they probably don't exist. There's really no evidence for them, but just to be on the safe side, let's go ahead and keep doing things the way we've been doing them, because that way, if they do exist, we're staying out of trouble, and it kind of helps keep society together. Everybody kind of knows we're on the same page, and we know what to expect, and these gods are, whether they exist or not, they're just a part of the way we do life. And so, let's not disrupt things too bad. We'll just go ahead and accept the fact that, you can believe that if you want, but really no evidence, probably not there at all. So that's the academics. Well, Paul engages with these Stoics and Epicureans, and they invite him, they bring him to court. The court is this place called the Areopagus. And when I say, invite him, it's kind of like maybe the police officer inviting you to step out of the car. It may sound like a request, and it may sound like an invitation, but there's a little more behind that, And so this is what happens here. These groups, they bring Paul, okay, enough of your talking, enough of your babbling, about these things. Let's discuss this further here. We're going to take you to the court that oversees these things in the city. And so they bring him to the Areopagus. Well, the Areopagus is a hill, and where Paul would have been, it's a hillside, but it's with the marketplace, and they probably would have met in what's called the royal portico. And so he's brought into here, and this court of judges want to hear what he has to say. Well, I'll give you a little bit more about the Areopagus. The Areopagus is a very, very significant part of Athens, because its roots go very far back. In fact, even into the mythological, legendary times. The writer Aeschylus, he writes about the forming or the beginning of the court at Areopagus, and it involves the gods. Well, kind of a long story short kind of thing. There was a murder among the gods involving humans. Well, if you didn't know, the gods of Greece and the Roman ones as well, these big pantheon of gods and goddesses, they're not any better than any man or woman morally. They make the same mistakes. They do the same things that are, just detestable. There's nothing good about the gods. They're just like men. They just have a lot of power. That's all. And they're from, time of ancient past. So the gods have come into a place, and there's been some interaction with man where there's been a murder. And so they meet on this hill, and they call it ends up being called the Areopagus, the hill of Ares, or the hill of Mars. This is the same name for the same god, who is the god of war. Ares, the god of war. And so they name it after him, where they convene their own court on this hill in Athens. Well, Ares sounds, really intimidating, the god of war, but he's really not good. He's not a very good warrior, and the other gods make fun of him at times for that. But anyways, they meet on this hill to have this court to judge what has been done with this murder. And they establish it, and it kind of goes on from there, and the Athenians meet on that hill and continue the court. And the idea is to establish true justice in Athens. And so that was the purpose of it. That's the stated purpose, to establish true justice. And so the gods are meeting there, and they end up deciding that this man who is heavily influenced by the gods, that he commits this murder, and they decide, we can't kill him. We can't, have the death penalty. And Apollo, one of the gods, he steps forward and he says this. He says that we cannot go this far. It's too far to go. The death penalty is just too severe. And this is why he says the death penalty is too severe of a punishment. He says because once a man's blood has been spilt and he dies, there is no resurrection. And so in the very founding of the court in which Paul is being brought to, there is a history behind it that points to the fact that the Athenians know from their gods and what they've always been taught that there is no resurrection, that it ends right there. If a man's blood has been spilled and he dies, there is no resurrection. And so this is what Paul walks into. Well, Paul walks into the Areopagus, and like I said, he's brought there by the group of the Stoics and the Epicureans, and so they bring him in there. And this is not a, hey, let's talk about it, let's debate, you tell me your ideas and I'll tell you mine, and we'll, see. No. Like I said, this is more like a trial. This is like, okay, we're going to have a hearing. Tell us what you're doing. Tell us what you're preaching. Tell us what you're telling our people and what you're teaching. Give us the details. Now, this is a very precarious situation for Paul, because one of the things that they do have the death penalty for, they actually decided, there are some things worth the death penalty. One of the few things they do have the death penalty for is introducing foreign gods into the city. Introducing foreign gods into the city. That's something they have long decided is worthy of the death penalty. And so that's what they're bringing Paul in on the charge of. Paul, you're telling us all this stuff about Jesus, and it's confusing to us, and it doesn't make sense to us, and it's nothing like anything we've ever heard. You must be introducing foreign gods into our city. And so that's why it's a very precarious situation for Paul. He has to defend himself against that. And so that's why he begins. He says, men of Athens, I see that around that you're a very religious people, and I notice that you even have an altar to an unknown God. I'm not introducing a foreign God in, to your belief system. You made an altar. And I'm telling you to whom it should be consecrated for. There is a God of the universe. There is a God above all these shrines and temples and everything else that you choose to worship. There is one God in reality, and He is above all. And that's the altar you should have, made for Him. And so, this precarious situation, he's standing among, this court, and he's making this declaration, and like I said, it's a very precarious situation, because if you remember from history, Socrates had to end up drinking hemlock, this poison, because he was given the death penalty. Why was Socrates given the death penalty? They accused him of introducing foreign gods into the city. And they said, you're disrupting the youth, you're leading them astray, you're confusing people, this is disruptive to our society. And they end up pointing the finger back at him and saying, you are introducing foreign gods into the city, Socrates. Maybe Greek's most famous philosopher. And he ends up getting the death penalty. He ends up dying. And so that's where Paul is sitting in the midst of, when he has to give his defense. And not only does he give his defense, but he confronts the Epicureans with their beliefs that are listening. He confronts the Stoics with their beliefs. He confronts the academics with their beliefs. He confronts the idolaters and their belief in all these gods. And he's confronting and confronting and confronting, and then pointing them to the true God, Christ alone. He points them to Christ. And he says that he is a judge. He's the judge. Now, it's very interesting that he uses that, because you don't see that a whole lot in Paul's writings. He doesn't use that word in a lot. That Jesus is judge. There's a whole lot of other words that he uses much more frequently. Two things. He introduces Jesus as judge to them because he's standing amidst judges. And he brings up the issue of justice to them because their role and their job description is to know justice and to exert justice. And so he brings it to them in that way. When Jesus is on trial before the Sanhedrin, and they're questioning, and they're charging, and they're mocking, and all this is going on, Jesus tells them that he's the Son of Man. That's a figure who judges, who sits on the throne with God. He says to the Sanhedrin, that court who is judging him, you're looking at the real judge. What does Paul say to this court? Standing amidst judges, Jesus is the judge. He's the one in charge of bringing about true justice. And that's what we see in Acts 17. Hope you enjoyed this, and hope you can help put it together with some things that we're going to be discussing in our sermon on Sunday. And God bless.